the spirit of Bitcoin. I'm BTC Minstrel. And this is a topic that I have been exploring personally for a long time. I would say it's the thing that drew me to Bitcoin. This sense that Bitcoin is a phenomenon that seems to be genuinely transcendent in the sense that no one person can truly comprehend it. And I whittled away on this for years until I ran into Zambala Hodl, Stephen Lubka, and we started talking about this. And we had some wonderful conversations that went in some great directions, and we wanted to capture it. And I'm delighted to have Stephen here to help introduce this. Hello, Stephen.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. And I've always been pretty excited by the idea. Like you said, we've had some awesome conversations. And, you know, this podcast is an exploration of the deeper themes of Bitcoin, the values that underpin it on a cultural, on a social, maybe on some sort of embedded or implicit level. Those are questions we'll explore. Does it exist in those ways? But exploring that intersection, because something I've noticed in my time in the Bitcoin community is Bitcoin attracts people with shared values, but they come from communities and interests that may have nothing to do with Bitcoin. And it's created this incredible constellation of, yes, people who are very passionate about Bitcoin, but also people who are very passionate about other topics, which on the surface may appear to be unrelated to Bitcoin. But I think what we're going to explore in this podcast is that actually maybe there is more connection there than meets the eye.
What you and I have tried to do, and what I think is so enjoyable about this, is we really try to dig down beneath the surface and get specific about what's really going on here.
So without further ado, welcome to the Spirit of Bitcoin. This is intended as a series that will have a stop date. It's not an ongoing podcast, but the number of episodes has not been determined. Our goal is to produce an exploration of these other themes, which intersect with Bitcoin, and something that people who are interested in this sort of discussion can tune into as they come into the Bitcoin space.
I'm delighted to have you. Thank you for doing this. You and I have been having some walk and talk conversations for quite a while now, and they've sort of congealed around a theme or a pattern as it relates to Bitcoin and a whole bunch of other topics. And we thought we would sit down and record one of these conversations. And let me try to just lay out what I see as sort of the crux of what we're trying to uncover here through this dialogue. And you correct me and steer accordingly. But, I've been fascinated with this question for quite a while. What is the spirit of Bitcoin? And when I say the word spirit, I'm referring to, let's say a pattern of action. When someone says, in the spirit of so-and-so, right? In the spirit of my father, I would like to welcome you all to, well, that means my father used to do this kind of a thing over and over and over, right? And so Bitcoin has properties and it exists in the world as an entity that happens, right? And there are patterns to its happening. And, is there any insight to be gained from recognizing what those patterns are? And in particular, Bitcoin's been running for 14 years. It's reached a sort of $1 trillion cap at one point. It's attracted millions, tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions perhaps around the globe who are just absolutely captured by this, in terms of their attention. And as they come to it, they bring along other pastimes with them, other endeavors and passions and practices and interests and hobbies and, trends in some cases. And I think what we've recognized, and something I think we find in ourselves as well, is that there are patterns to these interests. It seems to attract certain kinds of communities that have a spirit as well in that sense. And so what our conversations have always explored, and what I hope we'll do more of today, is, how do those things overlap? What is the resonance between the spirit of Bitcoin and the spirit of these other communities and the members of those communities?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's such a fascinating topic. It's something I'm really passionate about too, because I mean, obviously I have my share of idiosyncratic interests that I kind of bring to my Bitcoin presence and voice and the stuff I talk about, but it's something I've noticed like more broadly in the community that people, there's these trends that have circulated through the Bitcoin community. There are pockets of Bitcoiners that are really passionate about other things. And somehow these things all kind of connect back into a constellation of interests in and around Bitcoin. And it's something that I think for people on the outside, they don't, sometimes it gets criticized as like, crazy Bitcoiner trends or Bitcoiner health trends, or what's this seed oil thing, or what's this, or what's that.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked before, and, I think we both agreed, and I've said like, it really misses the mark on what's happening there. It's not just that like Bitcoiners push these cultural trends through the community as some sort of like ideological signaling device. It's actually that, in my opinion, like you said earlier, like there are core traits and similarities, values and drives that people who become attracted to Bitcoin share, which lend themselves to these other interests and certain tendencies, as well as kind of the reverse direction there, where people get into Bitcoin and then Bitcoin changes the way they see the world, and then they become interested in other things. So I think it goes in both directions. The latter, I think kind of what's happening there, I've kind of made this argument that people get into Bitcoin and Bitcoin challenges the assumptions they have about money. And it challenges the way they think about that. And suddenly there's this realization that, wait a minute, the conventional narrative that I've been spun about money is either wrong, incomplete, or lacking. It is in some way not sufficient. Some people will go, much more, it's a total lie versus like, probably on the minimal stance, like it omits critical context or nuance.
Mm-hmm.
And like the moment this kind of happens and you have people that like, they believe this, and most people are starting from a really rudimentary place with the topic of money. Most people never think about money a day in their life in like the structural way. Like they think about having it, but they don't think about what it is or how it functions. So they're starting for a very rudimentary place. And it's that place which is being disrupted and contradicted. And then suddenly this thing that's so central to their life, money, I mean, you use it every day, and people are walking around after getting into Bitcoin like, everything I believed about it was wrong, or things I believed about it were wrong. And then that opens up the very obvious next question of, I wonder what else I believe that's wrong.
Yes, I mean, that in itself is very much the spirit of Bitcoin, right? In this pursuit of truth, this sense of proof of work, of stripping away falseness, inefficiency from the surface, and digging into kind of the bedrock of what is really going on, what's really happening. Let me list off a few of these areas just to give people some examples and set some context here. So some of and add to this list as I go. Some of the, I love what you said, constellation of interests that I've certainly noticed is, carnivory is a big one, the carnivore diet and meat eating in general. Classical architecture, sun exposure and walking, which you're a big proponent of. I see a lot of localism and homesteading. I see religion and theology generally, Christianity specifically, although that may be a function of my kind of algorithm, so to speak. We see a lot of traditional family values is another interest that comes up a lot. Similar to the homesteading stuff, kind of environmental stewardship, but not in a sort of save the planet on computer models approach, but this sort of transjective relationship with like your lived environment. And Certainly the energy front, nuclear power and fossil fuels. There's a lot of interest in that. Psychedelics, I see a lot of that too. I think similar to classical architecture, like traditional art, classical art, with a real focus on kind of craft and beauty, and I think a pursuit of, let's say, transcendental ideals or transcendent ideals, rather. And then, of course, gun ownership, right? The Second Amendment, 3D printed guns, the sort of sovereignty related to that. Is there anything you'd add to that list?
That was a good list. Yeah, I think you covered. We might circle back throughout the conversation, but I'd have to think pretty hard to come up with something outside of that. But I do have. So I think some people listening, like, you could very easily characterize that as just like a trad or a conservative grab bag of interests. But I think that misses the mark. I think that's not actually what's going on there. Like, someone might hear that and be like, yeah, you're just saying Bitcoiners are conservative. Like, so what? That's one way of looking at it, but I actually don't think that's the case. And actually, like, many Bitcoiners, including myself, including many people I know, started as liberals and discovered Bitcoin, and then, gradually worked their way into a different sort of worldview. And it's not because, like, I think it's not because it's a like more traditionally assigned to like a conservative camp. It has more to do with, like, if we view history. So Hegel had a concept of like dialectical history, and that human history, for people that are listening that are unfamiliar, it's like we swing between extremes, and we go all the way this way and then all the way this way. And then, hopefully we integrate and synthesize those extremes into something new, which transcends and includes both. I think the other way to look at this constellation of traditionally Bitcoiner interests is as we live in a society that has swung so far to the extreme of those things. And so when you're looking at the world in this cultural mindset and asking the question, like, what do we need to do? How do we revitalize our culture? Where have we gone off track? Like, something is clearly not working here in terms of, like, people are, very depressed, they're unhealthy, they're, many challenges in the
meaning
crisis. Meaning crisis, right? So there's this obvious question of, like, okay, like, what went wrong? Like, what are we missing? And so when you take stock of the world and you look at it, I would argue that most people are going to find that we've, like, swung to the opposite extreme of all of those values. So they're not selected for because they are, like, traditionally indexed as conservative or something. They're selected for because we're all the way over here and these values are over here. And more of that could help course correct us back into a more semblance of integration, a semblance of balance. And I think that's an interesting lens to take, because it shifts the perspective of what we're doing here, or what these people are doing. Because I don't see it as just like, these are my cultural values and, like, the world should be like this. I see it more as like a cultural movement, of a process of inquiry, of looking at the world, of trying to assess what we've missed, what would help bring the world back into a more functional balance. And maybe we get stuff wrong, right? I mean, when you're trying to assess, revise culture, you're going to make mistakes. You're not going to get everything right. You're not going to be, like, correct about everything. So it's not that I'm saying, like, all of those things are right, or that there's not a process of experimentation, trial and error. But the pursuit itself, like, what is happening, what people are doing, I just think is so much more fundamentally a, like, inquiry, where we're, like, questioning the world, looking into the world, trying to find the path forward. And it just so happens that the answers that a lot of people congregate around are these kind of core cultural touchstones that we cast aside at the beginning of the modern era.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to talk about briefly the podcast model of history, and also the inverted pendulum. So,
okay,
you just made me think, when you brought up Hegel's dialectical theory of history, it made me think of why podcasts are so popular right now. And of course, aside from the technological aspects of, production and distribution, I think the reason, one primary reason they're so popular now is because dialogue, and ideally dialectic, is such a fundamental neurological process for how the human mind makes sense of the world, and for so long, I don't know where we would put this point in history, but certainly within my lifetime and within mass media, it was a monological process of information distribution and meaning making, right? And it was coming from one place, usually from the TV, from the radio, from a talking head. And there would be, right, there would be localized conversations, but when suddenly you can hear, Joe Rogan's such a great example of this because he's such a sort of pugilant conversationalist, and he pushes people and they push back, and you get those different perspectives pushing against each other as a way of sense making that's so fundamental to, the human experience and human cognition that that is at, Hegel's interpretation of history is very much that same phenomenon, but just at a much larger time scale. Like, let's try this and then it doesn't work and let's push back the other way. And it's sort of eras pushing against each other as though they were having this sort of eon length conversation, Anyway, that was just a sort of a esoteric aside, but
no, absolutely. And it's like to be, this is gonna be a funny phrasing, but I think to be truly culturally progressive, I don't know what you call it, but to be on the side that is trying to keep culture moving and evolving and in line and in balance, your stance should effectively be, when we're over here with an excess of conservatism, you should be a progressive. And when we're over here with an excess of progressivism, you should be a conservative, right? That should be the way that somebody that's truly examining, what do we need more of? Like, what are we deficient in? Like, that shouldn't be a fixed position, because it's not, because society is not fixed. It should be a dynamic position that adjusts as culture adjusts. And that's what it is to be in service of, balance or evolution, rather than just a particular stance that you might occupy. Because there's a marriage of both of these things. Like, it is the combination of both of these things that I think gives society its dynamism. If 100% of the human population was conservative, or if 100% of the human population was progressive, you'd be going nowhere. Like, it wouldn't work. There's an interplay when it's in balance. And I think, like, identifying where that needs to move, where that needs to swing, is an art, and it requires being able to stand apart from culture, to be in some sense an observer, that who is you can never, like, I don't actually agree with the notion that one can, like, fully abstract oneself,
right? There's no view from nowhere.
There's no, exactly, there's no, but there is a way that you can take a step back, and you're still going to have your filters and your biases and your participation, but to try to just, like, take a look at it. So I think it's an interesting thing, and I've seen this play out, right? So I've seen these movements play out. Like, I went to college, probably in the height of, like, I was in college in like 2011 through 2015, and it was probably the height of the, like, Tumblr-esque social justice like movement, and I was in a college that exemplified that it was like that on steroids. And that was kind of like a formative experience for me, was watching these, like, kind of some elements of, like, mob behavior, of, like, witch hunts, of opinions, and
that was the height of when everything started to kind of hit that tipping point. You had a front row seat to the coddling of the American mind.
Yeah, exactly. And so I saw that, and that was obviously, like, I mean, it was a formative experience for me of, like, kind of just seeing how that all played out. But what's interesting is, like, I think it has moderated tremendously since then in this kind of model of swinging. Like, I think we have been moving gradually in the other direction. I don't know when the peak was. It wasn't, I don't know, maybe 2015, 2016, something like that. And it started gradually moving back. But, you know, if you watch culture, you see these swings. They're very real. But they also don't happen absent people being involved with them. They don't happen absent cultural vanguards of people who are motivated to try to just move things along a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, that's the narrative of zeitgeists, right? Kind of from zeitgeist to zeitgeist. I think. So I want to come back to the inverted pendulum, and by way of a term that you used earlier, which you didn't sound very committed to, and that's, you know, progressive. And I think within the context of what you were talking about, you know, kind of how culture progresses. Oh my God, I did it. I think that's actually one of the most dangerous or error prone words. Like, it frames what's really happening. And what it sounds to me like you're getting at is a steering function. You know, culture exists, let's say, as a set of frameworks, practices, and tools that we all adopt, a critical mass of us, you know, adopt, and that becomes the way that we do things around here, and that leads to certain kinds of outcomes. Yeah. And you can look back through history at culture, and you look at golden ages, and you look at those outcomes, and you say, okay, well, you know, what were the sort of beliefs and practices that were in place that, you know, that led to that? And then you look at sort of dark ages, if you will, and you say, okay, well, what are the practices there? And, you know, you get into this sort of strong man, weak man cycle of things. And what I think has been, I don't know, I don't want to say lost, I guess I'll say lost, is, you know, there's an older conception of history that it's cyclical. Mm-hmm. And I think the word progressive, whether it's used politically or even if it's used just in terms of cultural progress, is this very rationalistic scientific notion of sort of stacking culture in the way that we stack, you know, rational knowledge like math or physics.
Sats, bro, you missed it with the way we stack sats.
Damn it. And so, so I think the pendulum is actually a really great metaphor, because it doesn't actually go anywhere in a forward sense, you know. And so when your culture gets to the point where suicide rates are going through the roof, obesity's all over the place, people are chopping off their private parts because they think it'll make their lives better, like something has gone deeply amok and the pendulum has swung too far in one way, and we must steer the culture back. My question to you about the inverted pendulum is, if Bitcoin emerged inside of like a deeply conservative society, strict adherence to tradition and protocols and the ways of doing things, do you think the spirit of Bitcoin would pull it back in the other direction into more, I don't know, let's call it liberal types of, you know, endeavors or interests?
Well, my first response to that is I don't think it would emerge in that society. So like that's kind of like, I think the innovation impulse is so stuck in those societies,
right. It's the antithesis of conservatism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because it's such a kind of totalitarian excess. And that's the balance, right? Like that speaks to the balance here. So a few things on what you said. So there's the kind of cyclical model of history, right? That like we just repeat, like nothing new under the sun. Civilizations rise and fall and rise and fall, and culture goes through predictable ebbs and flows and patterns. Then there's kind of the Whig history, the progressive history that is like, it's linear. We're just moving forward. That is our inglorious, benighted past of ignorance, which we have clawed our way out of.
Right.
And now heading to the glorious, enlightened future.
Right.
I actually don't think either one of those is correct. And I think it's a spiral. There is such a thing as we're moving. We're not just endlessly repeating. And I think, to argue that there's no aspect of newness or now there may not be newness on core themes, and that's the repeating and that's the spiral. There are many like universal core themes that I think are repeated and are like echo throughout time immemorial. But I think we're also moving and evolving. I mean, you can look at humans today as very novel in some ways, as very timeless in others, right? But there are aspects to our society that have never existed before in the conventional model, unless history is not what we think it is. But and there's aspects that are repeat endlessly, that just eternally reoccur. And so I definitely fall into kind of, it's more of a spiral rather than a circle or a straight line.
Well, it's the coincidence of opposites, right? And I sort of fell into that trap of framing the topic as a, one or the other kind of a situation. And almost always it tends to be both. It's just understanding the aspects of either one and how they connect. Because obviously we don't just go back in time every 100 years, exactly. Every fourth turning, suddenly it's 1898 again. Like, time is always moving forward. But you're right, those patterns, and as those patterns reemerge and we feel like we're repeating things of the past, we still have knowledge of the past.
Correct.
And, and we do so in the context of that history.
Yes, exactly. Like, every season, think about it like a mountain, right? For like a metaphor. Every summer the rains come. Every winter the snows come. In the fall it's drier. And those things repeat endlessly. You see the mountain in the summer and the fall and the winter and the spring. But every time the rains come, they erode the mountain. And the mountain is a little bit shorter than it was last year, and a little bit shorter. And that process is linear. The mountain does not build back up in general. Like, it's going to always be shrinking. And there is a linear process within the cyclicality that encompasses its existence. And, you see that throughout nature, right? Like the world changes along, think about like Paleolithic Earth. It's never looked like that again. It probably never will look exactly like that again. It's going to keep looking different for the duration of this planet. And yet, what an enormous amount of cyclicality the Earth has, just tremendous cyclicality. And, to use some ancient philosophical, commonly held notions, like, we mimic the world. We are in the image of the world. The world has these qualities of linearity and cyclicality, and so do we, our culture, and it's embedded in everything all the way down.
Yeah, we're part of the world. It makes me think of that video. It's not a video. I mean, it's an animation that I've seen making the rounds in the past several months of the solar system traveling through the galaxy.
Yeah.
Right. Is we're so used to thinking of this heliocentric. Yeah. Heliocentric, where, like the sun is sort of in one place and we just rotate around it. But in fact, the sun and the whole works is also moving around, the center of the galaxy, which is probably moving around something else. It's just probably moving around something else. And so, there's probably even more layers to the sort of cyclical nature and the cyclical / linear nature of time than we can even comprehend. So I would love to get to one of these particular topics.
Yeah.
Specifically, sun maxing and walking. This has become quite the trend lately. You are certainly at the forefront of that trend. I want you to talk about what it is that you find useful, beneficial, rewarding in that practice itself, but then also, what does that have to do with Bitcoin? What is it about the spirit of Bitcoin that is reflected in that particular practice?
Yeah, love that. So what do I find rewarding about it? I mean, like, the fundamental answer is my system, my body mind, does not function properly if I do not do this. Hands down. properly maybe meaning, I say proper because I believe that's a correct statement. I think it's kind of proper as in the proper state for a body mind.
Adhering to the form of a human being. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I believe that is literally the correct form. Our systems evolved with these very specific inputs that they are completely dependent on. So both proper, but you could also use the word optimal for people that aren't going to get on board with properness. So my body mind does not function optimally. It functions suboptimally. My thinking is less clear, less creative. My energy levels, my ability to function, my attention, my concentration, more, brute physical hormonal balance, like recovery time, athletic performance, all of these things suffer if I am either inside all day and do not see the sun for critical circadian and kind of like biochemical and bioenergetic inputs in terms of like mitochondrial dynamics. And then also if I am sedentary. So if I sit in a chair in the sun all day, well, that's also not, I don't feel the same as if I move around. Something I do I'm probably in the 99th percentile among human beings here, at least in the US and in industrialized countries, like barring wonderful podcast opportunities like this and client dinners, like I almost never sit for more than an hour or an hour and a half at a time period ever. I like outside of just certain things that require that, I move consistently, and it's the reason I do that. It wasn't a plan. It's because that's how I function optimally. I feel the best. And I've done this for so long now, and I've paid so much attention to these variations in form and function that I can spot the difference. If I sit on a couch for 3 hours watching TV, computer, screen time, I can do that. It's fine. But at the end of it, I notice that I don't feel the same that I would if I'd been moving, if I'd been outside with certain, breaks. There's a threshold there where I think just the brain and the body, certain things just start to struggle more so. So that's
if you just state it let me frame this a little bit more for you. If you just state it in the extreme opposition, sit in a dark room all day.
Yeah.
No one's going to, well, I shouldn't say that. Somebody probably will. You would think that most, critically thinking individuals will say that's probably not very good for your health to sit in it. In many places in the world, that's called prison.
Yeah.
So there's a spectrum there, and you're headed towards this other end of the spectrum. And without getting too technical, I suppose, I'm curious what you think is the right end of that spectrum, or what's too much walking and sun maxing.
Yeah. Your body will tell you what is too much sun. It's really obvious. So you get a sunburn, that was way too much sun. But your body will tell you before that. You'll feel, I got to get out of the sun. It's hard to even describe the sensation, but we all know it. I think there's I
like what you just said. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel like this is a really important point that I think is, I don't want this to become like a catchphrase, but kind of in the spirit of Bitcoin is I kind of pressed you for a technical answer. Can you give me the number? What's the data on that? Right. Yeah. And you push back in a way, figure it out for yourself, man. Yeah. You didn't say it in that kind of a tone, but it was, it's slightly different for everybody. And what you need to do is be aware and be mindful and be in touch with what is happening. Right. You can't be separated from your body mentally. You have to be in tune with it. And that awareness, that transparency, and that sort of ownership, yes, I think is a big part of it.
Exactly. And that is, to go off that would have been my answer to the second part of the question of why do I think this concept has had traction with Bitcoiners? Why did Bitcoiners start to get into this, into the walking, into the sunlight. And I think there's many things. I think one of it is, like you said, it's like health sovereignty, it's ownership. It is like building a life that is like, you know, an aspect. Sovereignty isn't just not having someone else have control over you, right? So one way you can lose your sovereignty is someone else has control over you. But there's another way, and it's you don't have control over yourself. And you have lost your sovereignty to yourself or to the world, in sort of a broad way of speaking. Your health stops to function. Your body isn't, you know, you want to be able to do X, but your body can't do it. You don't have the energy, the focus, the strength, the whatever.
Yeah.
And not that I'm proposing some sort of model of freedom that is like perfect autonomy, free of all restriction, because I think that's juvenile. But having no autonomy and no control is also juvenile. That's what it is to be a child. And so, you know, there's this other form of sovereignty that is having sovereignty over oneself. And that is something that must be earned and developed by the individual. And I think there are themes of that in this, that Bitcoiners want to feel alive. They want to feel in control. They want to feel vital. They want to feel potent in the sense of being able to impact the world, to enact their will, to enact change, to enact their passions and motivations. And I think what happens is a lot of people, I mean, I have the receipts, but they start walking in the sun. They get out in the sun, they do 10,000 steps a day, they see the sun at multiple intervals, and suddenly everything just starts to work better. Their minds work better, their energy levels work better, their bodies work better, and it plays into this self-ownership, self-authorship, sovereignty, autonomy. And frankly, like there's no substitute. There is no second best for the sun. There is no second best for specifically walking. And I will make this argument until I'm blue in the face. There is no substitute. Going to the gym does not count. I love the gym. I weight lift regularly. It's like lift heavy things, do it. Run, play sports, do all that sort of stuff. That's great. But how many hours a day can you deadlift?
Yeah.
And what are you doing when you're not? If that's your only thing, then you're sitting, you're sedentary. Walking is the only thing you can do for sufficient lengths of time that interrupt this sort of sedentary period because of a lower demand it places on the body.
Well, just getting back to basics, I mean, we evolved to walk.
Exactly.
That is one of, if not the fundamental movement pattern of humanity. It's like not letting a dog run, you know, not letting a rabbit hop. I mean, this is the form of the human, to get back to your, you know, your early. So to think that somehow this thing that we've evolved to do most of the time is actually an unnecessary activity that we only need to do a couple minutes a day, and then expect everything to function optimally, if you will, right? Is fooling yourself. Now you got, well, I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole. I was going to say, you know, your comment about having sovereignty over yourself is very fascinating. I think there's a lot of psychological and philosophical implications there, because there are two yous in that sentence, you know, and like, who are we talking about? But I actually want to, I want to riff on a couple of the sort of spirit of Bitcoin elements that appeal to me in almost a symbolic way. I think when you're moving, you're active, and there is something that appeals to me. I don't even know if appeal is the word, about how Bitcoin never sleeps. You know, every 10 minutes, there's another block, and it's in constant motion in that sense. It's always calculating. It's always moving. It's always moving. There's never stasis. Now, you're not advocating that we're never static, right? Because we're not Bitcoin, we're human beings. But there is this sense of, I don't know what you would call it, a rolling stone gathers no moss, but there's something to that. the other thing that appeals to me about, first of all, when you're walking outside, right, that's sun maxing and you're kind of combining the two there. But what is the sun historically throughout human culture? And you could argue biologically as well, right? It's the source. And I think symbolically it's served as the source of truth, the sort of ultimate source of life. And of course, what is Bitcoin concerned with? If you ask many Bitcoin philosophers, let's say, right, it's concerned with truth. It's proof of work, right, in that sense. And so to go out and greet and engage with what has historically been considered symbolically and biologically a source of truth, a fundamental source on a daily basis. I don't know. I don't have the technical chops to break that down, but it feels right to me.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's an interesting parallel. One thing really jumped out at me at what you said, and you were talking about Bitcoin never sleeps. Bitcoin continues to move. Things which can, like, what things rest, what things completely stop, and what things never stop? Well, the things which never stop are life. Life, there is no cessation of biological processes. If they do, that is called death. That is the end of the organism. The organism ceases to exist. So biology is constantly running. What is not constantly running? Machines, actually. Machines can turn on or off. They can be completely off and then they can be completely on. Biology cannot be completely off or completely on. It can be on, and if it is off for any length of time greater than like a split second or some sort of near-death thing, it is off forever. Bitcoin, while obviously you could turn it off and on, if it were to go off, it would kind of cease to be Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin went off with any degree of regularity, right? If the network went down, if the blockchain went down, it would kind of lose its value, right? Like, part of the value is it is this continuously running, globally distributed settlement system. And so in this kind of spirit of kind of the analogies between these things, it is analogous to life, in a sense that it must continue to live. It must continue to operate. It cannot be down. It cannot have gaps. It must just continue to run. I thought that was interesting.
Life is motion.
Yeah.
And music is my beat. That's the lens that I see much of the world through. And, I'm not the only person to suggest that music is one of the most beautiful and nuanced sort of mirrors of life and the human experience. And the same thing goes for music. When the music stops, the music's over. There is no music. Music is fundamentally motion, and it has to keep going. One of the things that's fascinated me about this, I'll call it a trend for now, in the sense that it is trending, like it's becoming more popular, right? More, and I don't mean that in any kind of a derogatory sense, but the walking, the sun maxing, is spreading in a very decentralized way, right? And I think most of that's kind of the essence of this whole podcast, to some degree, right? Is that certainly decentralization is core to the spirit of Bitcoin. And spreading in an organic way. I don't know. I don't want to drown in my thoughts too quickly here, but it spreads by one person noticing it and trying it and liking it and then sharing it, and another person noticing it and trying it and liking it and sharing it. You haven't started the Sun Maxing Institute, right?
No.
You haven't lobbied for legislation around 10,000 steps a day. None of this is being forced upon people. They are trying it out and experiencing proof of work. And for most of them, it seems they kind of like it, and things are getting better. And so then they tell other people. And so this thing sort of spreads, which is proof of work, but it's also truth. I was going to say the truth shall set you free. I don't know that's quite it, but like, truth can't be contained for very long. I guess I'll stop there before
No, yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, no Sun Institute. I don't have a newsletter. I don't have a product. I've never made a single dollar off this. I've never told anybody like directly to do it. It's so why does it happen? Well, people see it, they try it, and they experience directly a benefit from it. They don't get me telling them something. They do it, and there's something valuable there for them that they take from it. That is
It's
not
consensus.
Yeah.
Right. It's not command and control.
Yeah.
It's consensus. And that
They
is
validate
really
it. They validate.
They validate, right?
Yes, exactly. And it's because like the reason I share it, is not because like I'm trying to be an influencer or a sunfluencer. It's not because I'm trying to make money. It's not because I'm trying to boost my profile. I had literally no plan. I had no strategy. I was just talking about something that benefited me. And the reason I started talking about it was just that it benefited me so much. And there's a natural human impulse, I think, to proselytize, right? Like we're fundamentally like proselytizing organism. When people do with Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is proselytization. People discover Bitcoin, it impacts them positively, they share it. Yeah. I discovered that when you walk a lot and you see the sun frequently and you feel good, you function better, and there's this natural impulse to want to share the things that work for you with other people, and that's the only reason I did it. It's the only reason I started talking about it. And and also because I had a kind of a, there's things you can discover that benefit you that you can kind of know like wouldn't benefit anybody else, or like are idiosyncratic to you. Like there's, maybe like not exclusively, but like it's like you have a specific problem and only people with that specific problem would benefit from that. But I was willing to bet that, just given the fundamental nature of some of this stuff, that was not the case here. This was kind of more of a universal, like, going back to what you said earlier, like kind of the telos, the ultimate direction of the human organism. Like, what is a squirrel with no trees? Well, it's less of a squirrel than a squirrel is, in my opinion. It has lost some of its squirrelness. And I think same thing is for humans, right? Like, we are circadian organisms. We are ambulatory organisms. To not have that is to lose some of our organismic kind of telos. And so, there was this, like, I was willing to wager that this thing is like relatively fundamental. It's completely looked over by culture, and that, it might be beneficial. And I think Bitcoin does, in many ways, Bitcoin is very similar, right? Like so going back to the beginning of the conversation, I think Bitcoin is both conservative and progressive. And I think that's one reason both conservatives and progressives like Bitcoin, and find value in Bitcoin. You have a lot of progressives that are into Bitcoin now. Historically and today I've had lots of conservatives that are into Bitcoin. And I think it's because Bitcoin is both conservative and progressive. It is conservative in the sense that it is kind of a return, right? It's saying, hey, this fiat monetary system, this new structure that we're doing, we've kind of missed the mark here. We've kind of gone off the rails a little bit. And this former monetary paradigm of gold, like fixed supply, like money not issued as credit, like issued from thin air, that had a lot of things right, and we need to like return to a lot of those aspects. But Bitcoin is not gold. Bitcoin is not just a return to the gold standard, because that wouldn't work today, right? Back to kind of a dialectic theory of history. We moved on from gold for a very important and valid reason. There's a reason we stopped using it. It was vulnerable to capture. It was hard to settle. It was bad for international trade. It was natural that it became replaced with derivatives because of its cumbersome nature. So Bitcoin is not just like this purely, it's not return. Bitcoin is not screaming return. It is proposing something new. We've never seen anything like Bitcoin. We've never seen this sort of decentralized open monetary network, this global settlement layer, this self-custodial financial asset. So in that sense, it's progressive. It's something new. It's driving us forward. At the same time that it's calling us to return. And so it's this incredible marriage, I think, between those two fundamental human impulses of maintaining like tradition of maintaining or maybe like returning to the past in some ways and pushing us forward.
Oh, bravo, bravo, brilliant. It absolutely is a return to the gold standard while not returning, while progressing, building on the essence and the spirit of what made the gold standard effective when it was truly in place, but learning from that and doing away with those things that cause gold to be captured or lose its effectiveness. I think Bitcoin is a cultural gyroscope. And let me explain the sort of political framework that I operate on. It's certainly not mine. I don't want to claim ownership of it, but I found it to be a very powerful lens through which to view a political landscape and a cultural landscape for that matter, right? So there are conservatives who defend civilization against chaos and barbarism, right? And I don't mean conservatives as people. I'm not trying to identify tribes here, or pigeonhole individuals, but conservatism as an ideal.
An impulse. We have these two impulses.
I think there are three. So right. The conservative impulse is to, protect civilization against degradation and returning to an animalistic kind of existence where things are much more chaotic and less structured and dangerous and all of that stuff. And, civilization is there for a reason. And all you need to do is go camping without any supplies to figure that out. And then there is, I'll call it liberalism, for lack of a better term, and that protects the innocent against the powerful. That any kind of a civilization is going to create a strike. I mean, this is very Petersonian, right? Like he's certainly, Jordan Peterson is one that talks about this a lot, right? And any kind of a civilization is going to develop a hierarchy. There's going to be a system of power there. I use that as neutrally as I can. There's nothing inherently bad with power, but it's certainly, there's going to be people that don't fit well into that system. And so the liberal impulse is to find a way to protect to some degree and nurture to some degree those who are, who are left out of society. And when that doesn't happen, and you have, poor, wretched, suffering, disadvantaged everywhere, that crumbles society as well. That is not a good place to be, right? Go to San Francisco and you're going to see a lot of that. And then the third pole is protecting individuals against the state or individuals against the collective, let's say. And there's a dynamic there that I think you pointed to a little bit when you talked about how, perceiving freedom as a complete lack of responsibility is childish, right? Like we are social animals. There are some people who live alone in a cabin in the woods. Okay. But by and large, human beings exist and survive in communion and cooperation with other people. And there are certain responsibilities to that collective group if you want to benefit as an individual. And so you have to manage that dynamic. And Bitcoin seems like, as a monetary good, as a monetary system, something that through the sort of essence of its game theory kind of balances, or I think has the potential to balance all of those three poles culturally, right? Like the incentives are such that it helps to construct civilization while also helping to, protect the innocent from power. I think of like the story of like Afghani girls who were coding, and getting, or like, leaving an oppressive regime and taking all of your wealth in your head that can't be confiscated, and then of course the self-sovereignty, be your own bank essence of being an individual, but the network itself, right? And nodes working together to, validate transactions and share transactions. It's very much a community effort. The concept of consensus, like it's all built around these things.
Yeah. So something you make me think that I've been exploring for a while, and I think like ties really nicely into the discussion of the spirit of Bitcoin. I pretty much truly believe at this point that To only know Bitcoin as a technology, as a network, as a monetary asset is to not know Bitcoin. And what I mean by that is Bitcoin is fundamentally, it's a cultural technology as much as it is a tangible technology. And you can make this claim in a really structural way that's very obvious of that, like, social consensus, cultural consensus. Like, if we all agreed we could fork Bitcoin to do anything, right? Like, the only thing that stops us from forking the Bitcoin network into, you know, anything is that is a layer of cultural consensus. And so what Bitcoin did, it didn't just invent a technology in the traditional sense. It invented a cultural technology. It invented a technology that could serve as a Schelling point for this sort of cultural dynamic, which not only preserves Bitcoin's decentralization, but I think is actually like very fundamental to understanding it at all, or what it is. Because like Bitcoin has just served as this locus for people's optimism, for their hope about the future, for their passion, for their struggles to try to change the world, to navigate the world. And some of that you could say is like mechanical, right? Like Bitcoin could literally change that in a kind of physical or tangible way, a mechanistic way. Whereas some of it is more abstract, but I actually don't think the abstract qualities are lesser or less important than kind of the physical things. I think Bitcoin is this like tremendously important cultural coordination point for people. And to really get what it is this, because what is Bitcoin really? It's a fucking spreadsheet, man. Like, what do you think? It's a fucking spreadsheet. That's all it actually is. Like, taking some liberties with description there. I mean, obviously, like, Excel sheets aren't run by proof of work. Like, I'm not shitting.
Right. There's a mechanism that builds and shares the spreadsheet, but certainly one of its
spreadsheet. That's
essential characteristics is that it's just a big spreadsheet that we all contribute to. Right?
And yet it's so much more than that. Right? Like, it's so much more than a spreadsheet. And why is that? It's because human beings have coordinated around it, have and put all of their energy, their hopes, their aspirations, their mission, their drive. They've wrapped it in and through this thing and are using Bitcoin in a coordinated way to affect these things. And I mean, that like Bitcoin is spirit in that sense. It has spirit. It has something intangible about it, which cannot be found in its code base. It is found at the cultural layer. It's found in the minds of human beings who engage with Bitcoin. That both protects its consensus layer and is just a critical component to understanding how it functions in the world. Like, Bitcoin adoption, Bitcoin uptake, Bitcoin communication and education does not take place technologically. It's not part of the code base. It's part of human beings telling stories. It's human beings sharing narratives, human beings putting their time and energy into this thing. And like, I just don't believe you can understand it without this point.
Well, it's like saying, what is the sun, man? It's just a flaming ball of gas. Right? But it interacts with every aspect of the world as far as we're concerned. Exactly. And of course, what has the sun provided for humanity for eons? Not even just humanity, all life, right? It's a Schelling point in a way, right? It feeds us with energy, but it also focuses us. It draws us toward it. You know, think of the vegetable world. Is that how you say it? The vegetative world, the vegetable.
Yeah.
Sounds so weird to just say vegetables. Think about vegetables, Stephen.
Yeah.
But like, what do they do, right? Like,
1,000 carnivores cry out in rage.
You know, it draws it towards it. it draws them towards it. It becomes a focal point. It becomes a sense of direction, which, I mean, now we're starting to get into that telos territory again, because, how do I sort this out? I mean, you were saying how Bitcoin lives in the minds. It draws people towards it. It inspires them to seek the truth. I mean, if I take the walking in the sun maxing just as an example, try this out, see how it works for you, right? And if it works, let's say in a physiological sense, you start to recognize some improvement. And you look at some of these other elements, carnivory, right? Try this out. Eat just meat for 2 weeks and see how you feel. Classical architecture, right? Design a house this, I mean, this is a little harder. You don't just design a house over a weekend, but
go design a house. Just go do it, man. Like for a week, just 1 week, go design a house.
You know what it comes down to, one of the, I think the most common thread across all of these interests, this constellation of interests, as you so beautifully said, is a quest for human flourishing.
Yeah.
Right? That's what they all tend to imbue, whether that's homesteading or walking or weightlifting or intermittent fasting or, nuclear power. It's all about how can we maximize human flourishing. And Bitcoin is sort of like the sun in that sense that it seems to be drawing all these things towards it and energizing it. And so then we're left with that question: is there in fact sort of a platonic form of human flourishing?
You're actually correct, because you're actually correct in even a really kind of mechanistic sense, because it does literally energize it, because the people who adopt Bitcoin receive money, which they can use to do these things.
Now we're talking about Bitcoin as a human energy storage unit.
Yeah,
it's a battery.
You can look at it as like people who came to Bitcoin, who got Bitcoin, who invested in Bitcoin, they received money returns on their investment, assuming, they held it for a while. And they can then use that money to do these kind of other endeavors. They were energized by it. They were imbued by it. So you can kind of literally say that. That's interesting.
Yeah, I was actually talking with a friend of mine today, whom I may have subtly orange pilled. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. We'll see. And he was lamenting he was lamenting the lamentations of kind of Gen Z and millennials, and this I don't even want to call it a lethargy, just a sense of giving up. Maybe it's nihilism, but I'll never own a house. Clearly that's not going to happen. So why? But there are all these things that represent the good life, so to speak, traditionally in our culture, that according to him, this generation feels are completely out of reach. And so rather than, wallow in that feeling of loss, the coping strategy is to sort of give up, don't bother, and what were we talking about? I guess Mr. Beast videos and the sort of relentless. So the strategy is no longer, well, if I can just work hard, and live an honest life, then, and provide value to other people, then I'll be okay. I mean, financially, but let's just say materially, I will find a way to get by, and I will not be, relentlessly plagued with anxiety and depredation. Right. And I was telling him how, this is a massive function of the money, and how it gets less and less valuable. And so, so now the strategy is, since I can't do that, I'm just going to have to gamble, and I'm going to, take the Mr. Beast model, which is, perform some sort of game where I trade my dignity for the chance to win lots of money, or hope that someone who has lots of money will benevolently, gift it to me through these sort of ostentatious, like, oh, I'm curing 1,000 blind people, kind of thing. And God, where was I going with this? Just that oh, I've lost my train of thought now.
Lethargy and apathy of Gen Z and millennials.
I guess maybe as an example of, fix the money, fix the world, but the inversion of that, and the degradation of it pushes towards the extremes, like increases human misery rather than human flourishing. And I guess if there's a point I'm pathetically trying to make, is how central the money is to the culture, right? That the money functions as a cultural kind of gyroscope.
Yeah. Yeah. You've talked about human flourishing at several points, and I keep wanting to add this on. It's like it's virtue aspiration in many ways. Like it is like this aspiration to virtue that you can find really centrally in Aristotle's writings and Greek culture and previous civilizations of this, that there are clear virtues, right? And this notion loses some momentum and steam around the, kind of the postmodern, which critiques the knowability of those things. But when you look at Bitcoin, you find a very virtue-led culture. This is something that has always stuck out to me as a firm believer in that the good is the good and the bad is the bad. And it is both knowable, discernible, and experienceable. And like it's utter cope to suggest otherwise. And just because two people don't agree explicitly on every iteration of that, and you can create weird edge cases like trolley problems, it just means you're a fucking idiot.
Yes. So that makes me think of the point I was trying to make earlier, which I can make quickly. I hope I didn't interrupt you.
No.
It's the notion of reciprocal opening versus reciprocal narrowing. And I think the point I was making about sort of Gen Z,
reciprocal opening, what does that mean?
So reciprocal narrowing is probably the more commonly understood term, which is you think of someone with addiction, right? Like I have a drinking problem. Well, let's say, I had a bad experience, or I've had a series of bad experiences, and I've tried to cope with that through drinking, and I've drank a little too much, and the effect of the alcohol, or the excessive alcohol at least, has made me, more cognitively impaired, which makes me less able to fix the things that were a problem in the first place. And so those problems get worse. And so in order to cope with them, I drink, and then it makes the problems worse. And to cope with the problems, I drink it, right? And so it's this downward
virtuous cycle
spiral, right? Yeah. Whereas a reciprocal opening is what I think you're pointing at, right? The pursuit of virtues. And it's like, man, the more I walk in the sun on a regular basis, the more energy and clarity I have, mentally. And then things tend to go a little bit better at work, which means I make a little bit more money. So I have a little bit more time to walk in the sun, which means that I'm thinking, like in sort of increasing in power and being tempted by the good instead of just tempted by, whatever you want to call it, the bad.
Tempted by the good. That is a phenomenal phrase.
I don't want to take credit for it. I think it goes way back into the Greek.
First time I've heard it. That's phenomenal. Tempted. Yeah. But so like the word tempted there is so evocative in terms of like, what is it to be tempted by the good? Anyways, love that. But it's this virtue aspiration, this culture of virtue is so fundamental in Bitcoin. You can see it even in very like material and robust ways of like the way Bitcoiners relate to Bitcoin companies and the standards they hold. There are standards. You can fail those standards. You're expected to live up to those standards. You're actually expected to do the hard thing, not the easy thing.
Yeah.
If you want Bitcoiners supporting your business, like you can't just do the easy thing. And it's such a virtue culture. It's such an aspirational virtue culture. And as as somebody that like really like aligns myself with that, and that's how I've oriented my life, is like that there are things worth pursuing. There are better and worse ways to be. I found that very vitalizing, energizing about Bitcoiners. But you can also see that like flows outward from the protocol of like this sort of the truth, the verification, the
proof of work.
Yeah, exactly. Like it has analogies to this sort of virtue culture that has sprung up around it. And to quote somebody that is not going to be too popular, this actually aligns with one of Karl Marx's observations, and it's that the material culture influences the culture. Like technology, like it's kind of his notion of materialism, which I'm not saying I agree with in any sort of wholehearted way, but there's an insight there that the substance of our material reality does influence our society. And when we invented the factory, well, people stopped living on the farms, and that was a direct result of the factory.
Yeah.
And inventing a peer-to-peer verifiable self-custodial ledger and asset, well, that culture is like the culture that springs up around that technology was never ever going to be trust the priesthood. You see what I'm saying? We're going to do all this trouble to create this self-custodial asset, and then we want you to hand it over to the banks, right?
Yeah.
That was never, there's zero realities where that's the culture that comes up around Bitcoin because of the tangible qualities of its material technology.
Antithetical to the spirit of Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And it's baked into the design. And you could get down this interesting rabbit hole about, well, its material qualities were actually imaginal. They were actually mental. They were an idea in Satoshi's mind that were coupled with virtues and morals and qualities that then were baked into a design. And so what really is a material quality separate of its kind of the idealism that produced it? But I don't think we need to go down that rabbit hole, but it's an interesting one.
Well, you remind me of that phrase, what is the squirrel without the tree? And that makes me think of niche construction. As an evolutionary concept, and the perfect example of this is the beaver, right? The beaver builds a beaver dam, and that changes the environment around it, which causes certain things to grow in different life, and which influences how the beaver operates. And so it's this, this notion that we are, as human beings, somehow separate from our environment. Again, the view from nowhere, right? These sort of abstracted beings that exist somehow above it all is false. And so if you take that presupposition, I suppose, that we evolve in tandem with our environment, right? That we have this sort of transjective relationship with our surroundings. When Bitcoin gets introduced to the environment, that is going to cause us to evolve in some way. I use that term very lightly. I'm not really getting at physiological aspects, though there is weightlifting and sun maxing. But clearly we're going to change as a result of this. I don't know what we means. I don't know what change means exactly. I'm sure we could, have another podcast and try to sort that out. But there's got to be some evolution. I mean, we're seeing it, right? We're seeing it at a sort of community level, at a tribal level, or in pockets, or something like that. We're seeing it start to happen again. And I think what gets us so excited, what makes us proselytizers, is that we are experiencing, Bitcoiners, generally speaking, are experiencing this reciprocal opening, and so we want to share that. We want to go orange pill, like orange pilling is an act of love. As obnoxious and ham-fisted as we can be at it at sometimes, it's still an act of love. It's saying, I want you to have this feeling. I want you to experience this reciprocal opening and this widening of your world in the way that I have, because when you're stronger, I'm stronger, in that community sense.
Absolutely. So I think I want to have one. There's one final topic I want to hit on, I think, before we close. And I want to put myself in the minds of people listening to this. And I think for some people listening to this, there might be a critique that emerges, and they might say that this conversation was overly analogical, overly metaphorical. It was not precise, that Bitcoin is, in a concrete or a rationalistic sense, it is not literally any of these things. It is literally just its material components. And that some of these were just, it was kind of
associative process and associative conversation.
Mhm.
And I want to kind of address that critique for our listeners, that I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And I think we live in a world and we live in a culture that has so prized this important yet narrow process of this very direct, very linear, analytical way of looking at things. And while that's very important for building skyscrapers and designing cell phones, it's also like very limited in understanding our world and our place in it, making sense of it, and also drawing contextual connections about the world we inhabit and how we inhabit it. And so why do I think like maybe some of these, why do I think this conversation is valuable? Why do I think like, you know, a comparison between Bitcoin and the sun is even worth talking about? Bitcoin is clearly not the sun. The sun is clearly not Bitcoin.
Obviously.
And yet, looking at the world in this way, looking at our technology, looking at our culture in these manners and fashions, it allows us to see things in a different way. It allows us to inhabit different lenses. It allows us to make new associations, and it allows us to understand what is more contextual and embedded and less explicit. So like the explicit truth of Bitcoin are its sort of objective qualities. But as I've said, like imagine a world where everything about Bitcoin is the same, right? Like there's still the same number of miners. It's still worth $30,000. It still has the same thing, but zero narratives about it exist. Nowhere you go can anyone discuss Bitcoin. Everyone is physically incapable of uttering any words or writing any words which in any way relate to Bitcoin. There can be no meta discussion. There can be no narrative. There can be no anything. And there's no websites. There's no anything. It's just this like very blank or like very unadorned spreadsheet software that you can plug into. And otherwise, there can be no discussion of it. What an entirely different experience. Your primary experience of Bitcoin is largely not the software itself. It is this meta context that has emerged around it. It is the culture that you find yourself in. It is the stories, hopes, and aspirations that have been crafted and interwoven into this thing called Bitcoin. It animates it. It gives it life. It makes it more than just a spreadsheet. And the reason these conversations and some of these conversations that are less explicitly literal, that are more analogical, that are more metaphorical, why they have value, why they have life, is because they help us inhabit the world. They help us inhabit the space. They help us enchant the world. They help, like, a human life without narrative is no human life at all. It's not human. Narratives are human scaled. They're how we relate to things. Like Bitcoin with no narrative is just not Bitcoin anymore. And why these conversations matter is because they help us situate our material reality within our narrative space. And that is something the modern world has really dropped the ball on. And I think it's absolutely instrumental to the meaning crisis and to all of these problems, in that we've just objectified and reduced the world into a bunch of discrete bits that are in no way situated in a larger narrative space.
Yeah, I mean, that was beautifully put. I think we don't exist on this earth simply to understand, right? Yeah. We are not, the ultimate aim of human life is not cognition. It's action. You know, we act in this world. We live in this world. We move around in this world. And so I think the fundamental question all of us are trying to answer, whether we know it or not, is how should I act?
Yeah.
What should I do next? And the way that we, uncover that, and it's still a mystery cognitively, like cognitive scientists do not know how this happens, but we have insight. We discover relevance, right? And like just what you said, having these kinds of conversations, they shift the, John Vervaeke uses this lovely term, the salience landscape. And you quite literally see the world differently. Yeah. It's like casting a magic spell almost. And so if you see the world differently, then you tend to act differently in it.
Yeah.
And that cannot be reduced simply to a set of logical propositions or numbers and
Correct.
symbols. Those are useful tools. They are not the entire toolkit, and they are certainly not the end goal of our existence here.
Exactly. McGilchrist makes a similar point where he says the way in which we attend to the world shapes what we discover there. And so the sort of attention we bring. And if we bring this reductionistic, dehumanizing attention to everything, then we find a reduced and world that is devoid of humanness, that is devoid of animation. That's what we discover. We discover this very reduced world. Whereas if we bring a different kind of intention, an intercontextual living attention, we find a very enchanted world. We find a very alive world. And I use the word enchanted very specifically. I use it on purpose. I don't mean to suggest some sort of like magic, but I mean to suggest the world that you saw as a child. So when you yourself were a small child and you looked out at the world was enchanted. It was imbued with life. This was not a belief you had. I'm not saying as a child you believed the world.
Right. It wasn't a propositional, condition. Yeah.
It wasn't that you thought there are literally fairies in the woods. No, it's that you looked at the trees and the trees penetrated you. They penetrated your awareness in a vital way. The interplay, the dynamic awareness between yourself and the environment, between yourself and the world, was fundamentally imbued with life and attention. And this was a view that you lost as you got older. This was a view that decayed, that was, or should I say, atrophied. It atrophied. It didn't decay. It's a muscle that stopped being attended to because our culture disenchanted the world. It found a non-living world of parts and particles, of which life was absent. And that's a story, right? That's a story that our culture told about the world. It is not a fact. It is not explicit. It is not verifiable. It is a story. It is the metaphysics of materialism. And it is very different from the perceptual world that you inhabited as a child. And so, it is the way we attend to the world, which produces what we find there. We can attend through this reductionistic materialist lens, and we can find a very reduced, very materialist world. I can put that lens on. I can see that world in that way. I can craft that story of just the very hard observable, aspects. But that's just a lens you inhabit. It's not intrinsic, and it's not a statement of what the world is.
Well, I think what you were pointing at a lot there is the notion of a spirit, right? Yeah. That we should be filled with a spirit, that we should have esprit. And I think that's a beautiful way to end this conversation about the spirit of Bitcoin.
Absolutely. This was fantastic.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much, Steve.
Pleasure.